So next I cut down that piece of oak that was leftover scrap from the original timber I cut down, and I'm cutting off the scrap on either ends, which left me with about a 3.5 inch wide by 2 inch thick piece that was about 20 inches long, and I just split that in half, so I had two sections. And then I'm going to put tenons on this because I'm going to put mortises on the table, so I have a nice strong joint that will hold up that cantilever top at the top edge of this piece. So those tenons, I just used my tenoning jig on my table saw to cut tenons on either side of the piece that were about they were 3/4 inch thick by about 1.5 inches long. And once I had those, I just used a miter gauge to cut off the scrap on either end of that tenon. It's pretty simple to do on the table saw, and I was left with my two pieces. So I opted to hand cut these mortises because these are such an irregular shape, and they have that big dip in the center now. Setting these up in some sort of jig just would have been more effort than it was worth. So I just used a spade bit to rough cut that mortise, and then once I had it to depth, I could go through with a chisel and just turn those circles into square and remove that excess and get a pretty quick mortise for both my pieces. So once I had these rough cut, I don't know if you could see it in the video, they didn't turn out perfectly square, so I just had to go back through and square up that one side was forcing them off square just a tinge, but this ended up working out pretty well. So once I had those, I could kind of set the tabletop in place and see what I was working with. With the tabletop in place, I could get a better visual of how everything looked and how I wanted to finish that, especially the top part of this piece. So I just went through and I rounded over that top edge a lot more. I made the cut in the middle a lot deeper, so this was much more detailed on the top than I originally had. So you can see that groove gets deeper and the top fans out a little bit more than what I had originally intended. Pretty much done forming the leg on the right, and I'm just going to copy the leg on the left to match. I didn't film a ton of this because this is the one where the figure is mostly on that part I was carving, and that just takes a really long time. I would say easily twice as long as the one without figure, just because the wood's much denser there, so the carving goes much slower. So I'm going to film a little bit of copy carving this one to this one, and you could see I also fixed that mortise, and it was just a matter of this wasn't square because I hand drilled it. So when I squared up, I believe it was the bottom portion of the hole, this now sits flat. You can see how it's higher than the one in the back that's not level. So like I said before I started, it wasn't a ton of more work. I kind of made this more prominent and dipped this in so this is more figured. And in the bottom you could see, it's hard to see with the shadow. In real life you could see more detail. I just widened this up a little bit and kind of detail carved the bottom a little as well as rounding. The whole thing's kind of like an oval now instead of square. There's really no more square parts on that one. So making two of something is never my favorite, but it's better than making even more multiples. It's just no fun to finish something, get it the way you want it, and then have to do it exactly the same on something else. But this was a fairly simplistic design, and with these power tools it goes by pretty quickly. So in order to get the second one, I basically would just lay the first one down next to it and copy that design. Now on this one you can kind of see it starting to form because of that huge hole in the top from where that bolt was. I couldn't go as deep in certain sections because I was starting to hit that hole in the center. But basically it's just a matter of going through and switching out the tools and copying that carving. But it is easier the second time around because you kind of know the process that will get you the results that you want. And like I said, this second one was much easier to work with because it didn't have that hard figured on the top. Oak in general could be a little bit more difficult to carve just because the grain is so coarse. your tools kind of get caught on that grain, whereas things like maple and cherry, which are more fine-grained lumbers, you don't have as much of a problem with that. But I really like the way white oak looks, and this is the lumber I had. So that is obviously what I chose to use. And then towards the end, it was nice on some of these longer pieces, I was able to use hand tools, and you just get such a nice finish with hand tools without having to sand. So then I switched back over to the top, and I just cleaned up where those two crotches meet in order to get a smoother finish. And then on these tops, I like to chamfer the edges to give them kind of a 45 on the edge. It's just a nice finish to the top. So I was going back and forth this entire build on how I wanted to finish out the center section of this piece. And I was originally thinking dowels, but I didn't know if I would like the way that looked. But I had a bunch, I take apart old wooden broken chairs that I find, so I had a bunch of old wood and oak dowels. And I decided to just put an obscene amount of them in there, far more than you would need for structure, but it created kind of a nice design. Now they were various sizes, thickness, so what I did was I went through and marked center on all my pieces and marked out how far they should be spaced apart. I think I had 18 of them. And then I went through and marked which diameters. I think they were 5/8 inch pieces and 1/2 inch pieces. So I did every other, so it would be a 5/8 one, then a 1/2 inch one, and I just marked which one was which because I was going to have to drill 2 different size holes. Once I had all those measurements, I transferred them to the other leg. So you could see my depth, I set it to 1 depth, so at certain parts it will drill deeper than other parts. And this is before I made my drill press table, and was one of the reasons I decided to make it, because I had that piece of plywood on there, and it just makes life so much easier with these bigger pieces. So I went through and drilled, I believe, all the large holes first. This was pretty easy because those pieces are flat. When you have a bigger table, the top and the bottom are still the same dimension. So then I went through and once I had that, I decided how wide I wanted them to be, which was based off of what the customer wanted. And I could cut all my dowels to the exact same length because I used my depth stop to drill the holes to the exact same depth. So then it was a matter of going through and fitting all the dowels, and this was a very long process because these are old dowels, so they weren't circular, they were definitely off circle, almost ovals in some cases. So I had to clean up all the edges on my portable belt sander and to get them circular in order for them to fit in these holes. And getting this together was a lot easier than I thought it was going to be, honestly. So after I originally test fitted that tabletop, I decided I didn't like it sitting flush on those 2 arms hanging out. So I decided to make a floating top for this. So on my 2 arms that are mortised into the back edge of the piece, I cut 2 3/4 inch dados. Then I had a piece of scrap, I believe this is red oak from a vanity build I did. This is the face frame off the old vanity that I kept. And I cut that out so that these pieces are now wide enough to fit in those dados, but hang up a little bit over the top of them by about 1 inch. So not only are these going to add structure, but they'll be able to kick that top off of the top of my 2 mortise pieces and look like a floating top. So once I had those pieces cut and in place, I just rounded the corners on them, and you could see now how that top floats off of the piece. It was a very subtle modification, but it just adds a lot of character to it, and I just like the way that the top meets the circular edge of those 2 legs. So once I had that done, I could finally glue this whole thing together. So all those dowels are going to be glued into place. My 2 arms will be mortised into place, and I believe I did this in two runs. So I put those arms into place with glue, let them set up. While those set up, I decided to stain my middle pieces. I wanted a color contrast because most of this is all oak in that center piece. I didn't want it to all be the same color, and I figured that staining these after they were in place without getting them on the arms would be really difficult. There were some trials and tribulations to pre-staining them, but I still think it was easier than to have done it afterwards. So after the arms were dry, I decided to add a little 45 in all the corners just to keep the tabletop true over time. So I had some spare 1/4 inch walnut laying around. I cut very shallow mortises into both my pieces so that that piece of walnut could fit in there nicely. I don't have to worry about it twisting or moving over time because it will sit in these shallow mortises. So I hand cut those out and then was able to fit that walnut in place, and I did this on both sides. So then gluing in those rods was pretty simple. It was just a matter of putting glue in there and attaching all the pieces, making sure they were all in the right spot. Getting it lined up and together was about as easy as glue ups go. It was just a matter of slowly working your way up. You could see all the glue dripping out of the holes as I go. So cleaning this, I made sure that I cleaned this up before the glue set, because getting it off of that stain would have been quite annoying. And then I was able to attach the top parts as well, so that whole piece glued up in one go. And then, like I said, I don't show it, but I really spent a lot of time with a rag and some sawdust cleaning off all that glue so that it didn't affect the finish. So after this, the customer specifically wanted some recesses to hold cups, and cup recesses can be tough. You can see I'm using a hole saw just to drill a little shallow recess, and then I'll chisel out the excess. So this is about maybe 1/16 of an inch into the piece, and I did 2 of them. And you can see I could chisel, and this is cherry, so chiseling this out was quite simple. At some point I also added a butterfly in the front. That was more for aesthetic than actually being nervous about the piece checking. But cups can be tough because there's so many different sizes, so I drilled this a little bit bigger than the bottom of a coffee mug. Was able to sand that with a sander, and then that was pretty much the last bit before I could clear coat this. And my clear coat finish of choice nowadays is General Finishes. It's a satin finish. It just goes on easily and it looks great, dries quickly. Sanding in between coats is quite simple. So I don't think I showed it, obviously, because I'm clear coating it, but those holes where the bolts were, I filled with 5/8 inch dowels just so they weren't solid holes anymore. You could see, it's kind of hard to see in the video, but that one piece with the figure and the oak, it was worth all the trouble of keeping it because it did end up looking really nice. Then on the top, I went with water locks. I used the finished water locks on the top just because that's going to be more durable than General Finishes, and it's rated as a waterproof finish, which is what you're going to want on most tops. So then in between all the coats, I just sand with first 300 grit sandpaper after the first coat, and then I switched to 600 grit, and after 3 or 4 coats on each, it just leaves a really nice smooth finish. So at this point, it was just a matter of putting on the finish, letting it dry. General Finishes dries much faster than water locks. Water locks you have to wait 24 hours. So if you're going to use it, calculate that into your finishing time, because that is, for 3 coats, that's a pretty substantial amount of time. But it's nice using these 2 finishes in tandem because aside from drying time, the application process is pretty much identical. So the last bit of this was attaching the top. So I drilled oversized holes into those two cross braces I have, and then I put smaller screws in there so that this top can have some room to float if it needs to. And then that is the end for this one. I tried to get some pictures of this in front of some sort of a solid colored background so that you could see all the grain and the figure. The cherry turned out really nice. The oak turned out really nice. I was happy with how all the parts started to play together at the end and became cohesive, even though it's a lot of different materials. And that's basically what it's going to be used for.